is anti-Semitism. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Dr. Charles Small is the founder and director of the Institute of the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, and he will give some review about the status of anti-Semitism today. Charles, please.
So thank you. So I'm really honored to be here. Yossi, thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be with distinguished members of the panel. I'm also, from my perspective, particularly honored to be here at the IDC. And I think what we're trying to do at ISGAP works well in this context. We find at ISGAP that people studying anti-Semitism know the history of anti-Semitism and the power of anti-Semitism. But those of us who study anti-Semitism know very little about the Middle East, about Islamic culture, the processes, the divisions in society in this region. And yet, on the other hand, those who are dealing with strategic issues and know the region well and understand the culture and the changing dynamics, we find in the world of anti-Semitism studies that not enough attention is being placed on the power of the ideology of anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitism is a strategic threat not just to the Jewish people or to Israel, but to Western democratic values. Yossi asked me to speak about the situation in the United States. Very quickly, the FBI in 2016 saw an increase in anti-Semitic incidences. The majority of religious-motivated crimes in the United States the Jews are the greatest target. The majority of attacks, of religious bias attacks, happen against the Jewish community in the United States. The New York City Police, for example, has seen a dramatic rise in anti-Semitic acts in the New York greater region. During the first 2 months of this year, of 2017, attacks against Jewish people in the United States rose 94% compared to the year before. So these statistics are alarming, and I can go on in great detail, but they're important to understand that there's a changing dynamic, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. The ADL survey, it's available online. I would urge you to look at it. They also document similar statistics of an increase of anti-Semitism. And I would just also like to say, just as a short story, Professor Larry Amsel, who's a member of our team at ISGAP, he's a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University, and he's starting to do a survey on the consciousness of American Jews to the security threat around them. And it's interesting, he observed as a New Yorker that when people come to New York, when businesses open in New York or institutions open in New York, that's the place to be. It's a sign of success and achievement. And yet Jewish organizations and Jewish institutions in the city of New York intentionally downplay their visibility for security issues. And yet, when you do a survey of most American Jews or New York Jews, many would scoff at you to think that there's anti-Semitism. In our office, we're headquartered in New York City, and I can assure you that our security, our day-to-day security in our office has increased substantially. We have a small office in the AJC building, and the security protocol has changed drastically over the years. This brings us, in a sense, to the university, what's happening on campus. The Amcha Institute, run by Tammy Benjamin, has done work measuring anti-Semitism on university campuses and looking at the impact that anti-Semitism has on students in American universities. And she discovered through her studies that over 100 institutions in the United States have reported anti-Semitic acts, anti-Semitic incidents on university campuses, and they're up from 287 in 2016 to only 198 the previous year. So she's seeing a 45% increase in anti-Semitic attacks at American universities. There's an important study done by Barry Cosman from Hartford, from the Trinity College in Hartford, and he did a survey that 56% of American Jewish students in a 6-month period have experienced anti-Semitism. women who experience sexist incidences or African Americans who experience racism only experience about 18 to 20%. So Jewish students in the United States are experiencing a more dramatic effect of anti-Semitism. And what we've noticed in our study, there's a serious gap between the experiences of older Americans compared to younger Americans. More anti-Semitism is affecting the younger generations than the older generations. And in a sense, the university is the gateway for the anti-Semitism to arise, that is arriving in the United States. I'll also be brief. There's anti-Semitism on the internet is becoming an issue, particularly in the United States. Thanks to the First Amendment, the United States is actually the home of many of the websites and the URLs of anti-Semitic and radical messaging. I just want to find my statistics, sorry. Yes, so the United States has the most instances of anti-Semitism in social media. In the United States, 68% of global anti-Semitism is happening from American URLs. More than 382,000 anti-Semitic posts on social media platforms from the United States were posted in 2016. That's 43.6 posts per hour, or about 1 for 83 seconds. According to the Pew Research Center, 62% of Americans who receive news through the media, and they are experiencing anti-Semitism. The data shows that 29 million surfers were exposed. 29 million surfers were exposed to anti-Semitism in 2016. So this is becoming an important issue. At ISGAP, we're also looking at funding of American universities, and this is an issue that I think requires significant attention. A concerted effort has been made from the Gulf states to put money into the United States, particularly universities, and this is becoming well documented. There's good work at the IDC and at other institutions doing this. In our work, we've also discovered domestic funding, major corporations funding American universities with an agenda that is pro-Islamist, and they are affecting the United States, funding American university to the tune of many billions of dollars, funding institutions, chairing and chairs of professorships, and changing the culture of universities. And I would argue that if we want to stop the BDS movement, the demonization of Israel, and not just Israel, but Jewish peoplehood, because diaspora Jews are also, in a sense, feeling the brunt of the attack and the demonization of Israel. Because if Israel is an apartheid, racist, Nazi state, and I'll get to this image in a moment, then Jews in the diaspora communities who have a strong affinity to Israel, to the problematic entity, they also become problematic and are targeted by the left-wing intellectual media and intellectual circles in the universities, and also, as we see, by radical Muslim populations in urban centers in Europe and also increasingly in the United States. So if we want to cut off the head of the snake, I would argue that we have to understand our enemy. We have to understand how, for generations, funding has affected American education. And intellectually, the Edward Said, the postmodernity that demonizes Israel in mainstream education, in mainstream curriculum at the finest universities in the United States of America, that teach young Jewish students to hate who they are as a people and distance themselves from their attachment and affinity to Israel, the Jewish homeland, and that this is mainstream education and causing all sorts of problems, including assimilation and the increased alienation from Zionism, and even famous pollsters in the United States saying that we should not, as a community, mention Zionism because it doesn't work anymore in the popular culture. And that's because for 2 generations, the head of the snake, the people who teach journalists, the people who teach policymakers, these are the people informing the next generation of leaders. So if we do retractions in the New York Times or in the media, it really doesn't matter anymore because the journalists at the finest universities have been inculcated in this sort of postmodern, post-colonial, politically correct ideology. And it's gotten to the point in popular culture. I have 1 minute. I'll just say in popular culture. We have this gentleman who is a very good musician named Roger Waters. He's the head of the cultural boycott, the main figure in the cultural boycott against Israel and the BDS movement. During his performances, he dresses up as a Nazi. He reenacts some sort of childhood trauma he had with his father. The stage is draped in Nazi-like flags. There's a pig floating in the sky with a Magen David on it. And he reenacts this image. That's bad enough. But when he gets off stage, in keeping in this image of ideology, when he gets off stage, he's calling for a boycott, like that image would instruct us he would naturally do, but he calls for a boycott against Israel. And given the political culture and progressive moment we live in, not only does he get away with it, he's making a fortune. He's the greatest solo artist grossing tour in the history of music. So he's very popular, and he's having an impact on popular culture and infusing the BDS into popular culture. And I would just say that the Jewish community and the human rights community should not stand for this, that there is a direct correlation between anti-Semitism and the BDS. And this is what we have done and many scholars have done through our research. And I would just leave you with one question. Could you imagine in my art, I put on a white sheet and I burnt a cross. And that was part of my art as a white man putting on a white sheet, burning a cross. And when I get off stage, I call for the re-enslavement of African Americans. Could you imagine if a Muslim crescent was on a pig floating in my concerts and I said we should boycott all Muslims? And yet our community in the United States and in the diaspora accepts this as art and beyond our criticism. And we should, in the keeping of the boycott movement, ensure that Roger Waters and other performers who stopped or tried to alienate Israel, the only democracy in this part of the world, that we get major corporations to divest from his concert tour, as American Express recently did. So this is, in my view, an opportunity to take a stand in the United States of America and fight contemporary anti-Semitism in our midst.